My name is Chloe Maxwell, and I've always been the practical one in the orbit of my husband Dan's rather performative family. While Dan chased ambitious sales targets, his mother Eleanor orchestrated elaborate social events, and his sister Megan curated her online presence. I, the freelance graphic designer, was the quiet background, reliable, useful when needed, mostly invisible otherwise. Maybe that's why, as I drove towards the imposing coastal New England house belonging to Dan's mother and stepfather for Thanksgiving week, a familiar sense of weary obligation warred with a genuine affection for the one person there I truly connected with, Arthur Vance, Dan's stepfather. The house, a rambling cedar shingle affair perched on a bluff overlooking the gray November Atlantic, always felt both beautiful and isolating. Dan had driven up the day before, citing a last minute meeting nearby. I arrived late Wednesday afternoon, my small car loaded with groceries, wine, and the pumpkin cheesecake I made every year, bracing myself for the usual onslaught of Eleanor's passive aggressive critiques and Megan's subtle competitiveness. But pulling into the long gravel driveway, an immediate sense of wrongness hit me. Dan's car was gone. So was Eleanor's SUV and Megan's sporty little coupe. Only Arthur's old, reliable sedan sat parked near the garage. The house itself looked dark, dormant. No welcoming lights, no smoke curling from the chimney despite the biting coastal wind. My stomach tightened with unease. I rang the bell. The sound echoed, unanswered. I knocked, louder this time. Still nothing but the sighing wind and the distant cry of a gull. The back door near the kitchen was usually left unlocked. Hesitantly, I tried the handle. It swung open onto a cold, silent kitchen. "Hello?" I called out, stepping inside cautiously. "Dan? Eleanor? Arthur? Megan?" My voice sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness. The air was frigid, the heating clearly off or set extremely low. Dirty dishes sat in the sink. No Thanksgiving prep was underway. It felt abandoned. My unease morphed into a cold prickle of fear. Where was everyone? Had something happened to Arthur? I walked quickly through the downstairs rooms, living room, dining room, den, all empty, quiet, cold. Finally, in the back parlor, the room with the large bay window overlooking the turbulent ocean, I found him. Arthur Vance sat huddled deep in his favorite high-backed armchair, a thick wool blanket pulled up to his chin. He looked impossibly frail, smaller than I remembered from just weeks ago. His breathing seemed shallow, but his eyes, when they flickered open and focused on me, were sharp, startlingly alert, holding an expression I couldn't immediately decipher. Weariness, yes, but also something else. Calculation? "Arthur?" I rushed over, kneeling beside his chair. "Are you all right? Where is everyone? Where's Dan?" He coughed, a dry, rattling sound. He didn't answer directly, just gestured with a trembling hand towards the mantelpiece above the cold fireplace. Propped against a silver-framed photo of a much younger Eleanor stood a single white envelope. My name, Chloe, was scrawled across it in Dan's familiar, hurried script. With a growing sense of dread, I picked it up. My hand shook as I tore it open. The note inside was brief, devastatingly casual. "Chloe," it read. "Sorry for the change of plans. Huge work thing came up. Amazing opportunity with Sophia in the Caribbean, couldn't say no. Mom decided she desperately needed a break too, came along last minute. Didn't want to disrupt Arthur, he seemed settled. You'll stay home and take care of him, right? He needs you, knew you'd understand. We'll be back Monday after New Year's, handle everything. Love, Dan." Love, Dan. The hypocrisy was staggering. A Caribbean cruise. For over a month. Starting before Thanksgiving. With Sophia, the colleague whose name had been popping up far too often. With Eleanor, his mother, who supposedly couldn't leave Arthur's side. Leaving me, his wife, completely unmentioned, uninformed, simply expected to step into the role of caregiver for his ailing stepfather without so much as a conversation. Abandoned. The note fluttered from my numb fingers. He... They just left? I whispered, staring at Arthur. They left you here? Alone? And went to the Caribbean? Arthur nodded slowly, his gaze holding mine. Tuesday morning, His voice was raspy but clear. Packed quickly. Said you knew all about it, that you'd be here Wednesday to take over. The calculated lie, the depth of the betrayal, hit me full force. They hadn't just forgotten me, they had deliberately manipulated me, used my sense of responsibility as a tool to facilitate their escape, their vacation, their whatever this trip with Sophia truly represented. I tried Dan's number, straight to voicemail. The phone felt dead in my hand. Then came the icy dread of practicality. If Dan felt comfortable doing this, what else had he done? My fingers trembling, I opened my banking app. The joint savings account, the one holding the 5,000 plus we'd meticulously saved for a down payment on a small house of our own, away from this suffocating family dynamic, it was empty. A single large withdrawal 3 days ago. He took our savings. He took our future and flew to the Caribbean with his mother and his colleague. He took the money, I whispered, showing the zero balance to Arthur. All of it. Arthur didn't flinch. Doesn't surprise me, he said, his voice raspy. They've been bleeding me dry for years, Chloe. A little here, a little there. For Arthur's care, Eleanor calls it. He gestured weakly around the cold room. Meanwhile, the heat stays off half the winter. My prescriptions get delayed, and Eleanor sports a new designer handbag every other month. The casual cruelty layered on top of the abandonment felt like a physical blow. They weren't just selfish, they were parasites. And they know. Arthur continued, his voice dropping lower, his gaze intense. They know I'm dying, Chloe. Dying? The word caught in my throat. He nodded grimly. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. Got the diagnosis 3 months ago. He tapped a worn, leather-bound book beside his chair. The reports are in there. Eleanor was with me. Heard the doctor give me maybe 6 months then. Weeks now, probably. He let out a dry chuckle. 2 days after that diagnosis, she started planning this much-needed break to the Caribbean. I stared at him, horrified. They knew he was dying, and they left him. Abandoned him. With me, the daughter-in-law they barely tolerated, as the unwitting, unpaid, uninformed caregiver. But that's not all, Arthur said, leaning forward slightly, a strange, fierce light entering his eyes. They think I'm just a frail old man with a modest pension in this house. He gestured again to the book beside him. They don't know about the other assets, the investments my late wife Martha and I made decades ago, the blind trust, assets completely shielded from Eleanor's reach, assets Dan has no idea exist. They think they're inheriting this house, maybe squeezing the last drops from my known accounts. They have no clue. He looked directly at me, his gaze sharp, assessing. They think they've left you holding the bag, Chloe. Left you with a burden. They see us both as disposable inconveniences. He paused, his breath catching slightly. But they made a mistake. A fatal one. They left us together, and they gave us an opportunity. My mind raced, trying to keep up. Hidden assets? An opportunity? An opportunity for what, Arthur? His thin lips curved into a smile that was surprisingly sharp, almost predatory. For justice, my dear. For making things right. They abandoned me on my deathbed. They betrayed and abandoned you. They don't deserve to profit from it. He leaned closer, his voice a low whisper. I need your help, Chloe. These last weeks, maybe days. Help me finalize my affairs properly. Help me document their neglect, their abandonment, beyond doubt. Be my witness. And I, he paused, his eyes locking with mine, will change everything. My real will. The hidden assets, they will go to someone who understands loyalty, someone who showed compassion when my own family showed only greed. They will go to you. We will ensure Dan and Eleanor inherit nothing but the consequences of their actions. The proposition hung in the air, audacious, terrifying, and strangely compelling. Ally myself with this dying man, my stepfather-in-law whom I barely knew, against my husband, my mother-in-law? It felt like stepping off a cliff. But thinking of Dan's casual betrayal, Eleanor's cold manipulation, the drained bank account, the cruise photos likely already appearing on Instagram, what did I have left to lose? They had already abandoned me. They had already destroyed the foundation of our life together. Arthur watched me, his sharp eyes missing nothing, waiting patiently for my answer. Then softly he asked the question that sealed our unlikely pact. Shall we begin? I met his steady gaze, took a deep, shuddering breath that finally filled my lungs, and nodded. Yes, Arthur, I said, my voice surprisingly firm, the quiet librarian finding an unexpected core of steel. Let's begin. The morning after forging our strange alliance, the house felt different. The silence was still heavy, but now it held a shared purpose, a grim determination. Arthur, despite his obvious physical frailty, seemed mentally sharper, galvanized by the decision to act. First things first, Chloe, he said, his voice raspy but clear as I brought him his morning tea. Evelyn Reed, my lawyer. We need her here, today. He made the call himself, his tone brooking no argument, explaining briefly that circumstances required immediate updates to his estate planning, and that I, Chloe Maxwell, his daughter-in-law, was now acting as his primary confidant and assistant in these matters. Ms. Reed, apparently accustomed to Arthur's occasional eccentricities, but recognizing the urgency in his voice, agreed to drive out from Boston that afternoon. While we waited, Arthur directed me to the locked drawer in his study desk. Inside was the thick folder labeled medical he'd mentioned, along with several notebooks filled with dated entries in his precise, academic hand. My observations, he explained simply, started about 6 months after Eleanor moved her things fully into Martha's old rooms, coincided with Dan losing that big tech investment. Funny how that works. I spent the next hour reading, my initial shock turning into simmering rage. The notebooks detailed a pattern of subtle but consistent neglect. Medications forgotten or halved, trying to reduce dependency, Eleanor had apparently claimed. Doctor's appointments canceled last minute. Dad wasn't feeling up to it. Dan would report. Nutritious meals replaced by takeout or microwave dinners, his requests for simple comforts often ignored. Interspersed were notes on suspicious withdrawals from his primary checking account, small amounts initially, then larger ones, often vaguely justified as household expenses or caretaking supplies. He had also kept printouts of pharmacy records showing discrepancies in refill dates for crucial medications, like his pancreatic enzymes and pain relief. It was a devastatingly clear picture of neglect bordering on abuse, masked by outward appearances of familial duty. Ms. Evelyn Reed arrived precisely at 2 p.m. She was a woman in her 60s, sharp suit, silver hair in an immaculate twist, with eyes that missed nothing. She listened intently as Arthur, with occasional input from me, laid out the situation. His terminal diagnosis known to his wife and stepson, their subsequent abandonment for a month-long Caribbean cruise with Dan's colleague, the drained joint account confirming my own abandonment, and the documented history of neglect Arthur had endured. He then stated his clear intention to completely restructure his will and trusts, disinherit Eleanor and Dan, citing abandonment and neglect, and make me the primary beneficiary and executor of his true estate, the hidden assets. Ms. Reed absorbed this without batting an eye. Arthur, she said finally, her voice calm, professional, your mental competence is clear. Your reasons are documented and, frankly, compelling. We can draft the necessary amendments immediately. However, she looked at both of us, you must anticipate a challenge. Eleanor and Daniel will undoubtedly claim undue influence on your part, Chloe, or assert Arthur lacked capacity when signing, especially given the timing relative to their trip. Exactly, Arthur rasped, which is why we need more than just documentation of past neglect. We need to document the present. Show them, show everyone, show the court if necessary, what their quick break actually entailed. And so the plan solidified. We wouldn't just document the truth. We would amplify it slightly, create a narrative for the outside world, specifically for Dan's sister, Megan, that would preemptively counter any claims of Arthur being fine when they left, or of me manipulating him in his final weeks. It felt strange, almost theatrical, but Arthur insisted it was necessary. Think of it as illustrative evidence, my dear, he'd said with a grim smile. Ms. Reed, after ensuring Arthur understood the potential legal complexities, made a discreet call. Within hours, a plane van arrived, delivering items sourced via her network. A non-functional but visually convincing oxygen tank stands for IV drips. We used saline bags. Older model vital signs monitors with detachable leads that looked suitably serious, even hospital-grade linens. Medical theater, indeed. We transformed Arthur's bedroom. With my graphic designer's eye, I helped arrange the equipment for maximum visual impact in photographs. The oxygen cannula placed near his nose, but not connected, the monitors positioned prominently, the lighting adjusted to emphasize the shadows under his eyes. Arthur, summoning a surprising reserve of energy, played his part perfectly, allowing me to take photos and short videos of him looking considerably weaker, more diminished than his current state, though the underlying illness was undeniably real and progressing. I took photos of myself too, looking weary, sitting vigil by his bedside, the regular bed, not the hospital one he detested, organizing the array of mostly empty or harmless pill bottles on the nightstand. Then came the carefully crafted updates to Megan, Dan's sister, the one family member who occasionally sent Arthur polite, infrequent texts. I sent the first one from Arthur's phone with his permission. Megan dear, feeling much weaker today. Chloe is here, thank goodness. Doctors discussing hospice options. Arthur. Followed by a text from my phone. Hi Megan, it's Chloe. Just wanted to update you, Arthur had a very rough night, trying to keep him comfortable. We'll let you know if anything changes. I attached one of the more frail-looking photos. Megan's reply was swift, laced with concern, but also distance. Oh no, so sorry to hear. Please keep me posted. Tell Arthur we're thinking of him. Wish we could be there, but hook set, as Arthur murmured. While maintaining this staged narrative digitally, I focused on gathering real-world proof. I visited Mrs. Gable next door. She welcomed me warmly, her eyes full of sympathy. Poor Arthur, she sighed. That Eleanor, hardly ever saw her take him out for air. And that son of hers, always shouting on his phone, barely glanced at Arthur when he came and went. She recounted the incident from last month when Arthur had fallen in the yard trying to retrieve his newspaper. Took my Herald 10 minutes to help him up. Brady Dan was inside the whole time, watching the game, window wide open. Didn't even come out. She readily agreed to provide a written statement detailing her observations over the past year. Other neighbors offered similar accounts. The pattern of neglect was well established in the neighborhood, even if no one had formally intervened before. We continued the digital performance for Megan. Another update, another photo showing decline, mentioning increased pain medication. I created a meticulous backdated medical log, weaving fictional entries about symptom escalation around the real dates Arthur had documented missed medications or canceled appointments. Finally, Ms. Reed returned with the notary Thomas and the finalized legal documents. The new will was clear, concise, explicitly stating Dan and Eleanor were disinherited due to sustained neglect and abandonment during terminal illness, with attached exhibits including Arthur's notebooks, neighbor statements, and potentially my correspondence log with Megan. The hidden assets, investments, properties held in trust were transferred into new trusts naming me as sole beneficiary and trustee. Arthur, remarkably lucid and firm, signed each document with a steady hand, his intent clear before Ms. Reed, Thomas, and myself as witnesses. Immediately after the signing, Arthur insisted on recording his video testimony. Proof positive, he rasped, for anyone who doubts my mind. I set up my phone on a small tripod. Arthur looked directly into the lens, his voice weak but unwavering. He spoke for 20 minutes, calmly detailing the years of feeling like a burden, the financial siphoning, the emotional neglect, culminating in their final abandonment. He spoke of our unexpected alliance, of my kindness. Jade Chloe, he stated clearly, correcting the name from the original transcript, showed me more dignity and compassion in 4 days than my wife and stepson showed me in 4 years. She has earned my trust, my gratitude, and yes, my estate. This is my clear, final wish, made freely and of sound mind. The recording was devastating in its quiet conviction. With the documents signed, notarized, and secured by Ms. Reed, the video testimony saved and backed up, our plan was complete. The trap was set. We had the evidence, the legal standing, the narrative. That evening, a strange calm settled over the house. Arthur seemed exhausted but peaceful, finally resting. I sat in the quiet parlor, the weight of the past few days immense. We had done it. We had gathered the proof, secured the future, prepared for the inevitable confrontation. But seeing Arthur, truly seeing the rapid toll the cancer was taking beneath the strategic performance, filled me with a profound sadness. Our victory felt intertwined with imminent loss. All we could do now was wait for Dan and Eleanor to return from their sunny Caribbean idyll, completely unaware of the storm that awaited them back home. The days following the finalization of Arthur's legal documents took on a strange, bittersweet quality. Our elaborate plan, the staging of his decline for Megan's benefit, became almost unnecessary as reality tragically mirrored our fiction. Arthur's strength began to fade rapidly, the pancreatic cancer tightening its grip with cruel efficiency. The oxygen tank, initially a prop, became a necessity some afternoons. The meticulous logs I kept shifted from backdated fabrication to real-time recordings of his fluctuating pain levels and weakening pulse, relayed discreetly to Diane, the hospice nurse making increasingly frequent visits. My role transformed too. I was no longer just an ally in a revenge plot. I became a caregiver, a companion in his final days. The shared goal of justice receded, replaced by the simple human act of providing comfort. I read to him for hours from his beloved Raymond Chandler novels, the noir prose a strange counterpoint to the quiet dignity of his dying. I played the classical music playlist he'd mentioned enjoying, the melodies filling the room where family should have been. We talked, sometimes about his late wife Martha, sometimes about his years in academia, sometimes just about the changing light outside the window. In those quiet moments, a genuine, unexpected affection grew between us. A bond forged not in shared history, but in shared vulnerability and betrayal. You know, Chloe, he rasped one afternoon, his hand cool and papery in mine. I haven't felt seen like this since Martha passed. Strange, isn't it? A daughter-in-law I barely knew shows me more kindness in my final days than my own wife and stepson did in years. The hospice nurse, Diane, confirmed the inevitable on a gray Saturday morning. Hours, she said softly, her eyes full of sympathy after checking his vitals. Maybe a day, at most. He's comfortable, peaceful. I asked Arthur if he wanted me to try contacting Dan or Eleanor one last time, despite the futility. He shook his head weakly, a flicker of his old steel returning to his eyes. No, he whispered. They made their choice when they stepped on that cruise ship. Let them enjoy their cocktails. He passed away peacefully that evening, just after midnight. Holding my hand, the sound of a Bach cello suite playing softly from my phone. There was no drama, no last-minute regrets, just a quiet cessation of breath in the stillness of the night. I sat with him for a long while, tears streaming down my face, a profound mix of grief for this kind man I'd come to care for, and a grim satisfaction that we had, at least, secured his final wishes, his final testament. At dawn, I called Diane, who came to make the official pronouncement. Then I called the funeral home Ms. Reed had recommended. Discreet, efficient, accustomed to handling sensitive family situations. I arranged for a simple private cremation and memorial service for the following afternoon, notifying only Ms. Reed, Mrs. Gable next door, and a handful of Arthur's old academic friends whose numbers were in his address book. There would be no grand funeral for Eleanor and Dan to perform at. Arthur's farewell would be quiet, dignified, attended by those who genuinely cared, not those bound by obligation or hoping for inheritance. The memorial was brief, heartfelt. Tears were shed, stories shared. Afterwards, back at the now overwhelmingly empty house, I placed the sealed cream envelope containing Arthur's final letter prominently on the mantelpiece next to the family photo. Dan and Eleanor smiling broadly, Arthur standing slightly apart. I arranged the evidence folders neatly on the coffee table. Arthur's meticulous neglect logs, Mrs. Gable's signed statement, copies of the medical documentation, pharmacy discrepancies. I queued up Arthur's devastating video testimony on the living room television, the remote placed beside the folders. Everything was ready for their return. They arrived back the next day, Monday afternoon, tanned, laden with duty-free bags and cheap souvenirs, chattering loudly as they came through the front door, expecting perhaps to find me frazzled but managing, Arthur still waiting in his chair. "Honey, we're home!" Eleanor called out cheerfully, dropping her bags in the hallway. Dan followed, tossing his keys onto the console table, Sophia trailing behind him, looking bored. Megan Maxwell, Dan's sister, brought up the rear. Self-correction, reverting character names to the correct ones for this story. Brady, Dan, Elaine, Eleanor. Esiel is Megan. Other woman is Sophia. Okay, using the planned names, Dan, Eleanor, sister Megan, other woman Sophia. "We're home!" Dan called out cheerfully, dropping his bags. Eleanor followed, tanned and smiling, trailed by Megan and Sophia. "Arthur? Chloe? Anyone here?" I stepped out from the parlor, dressed in the simple black dress I'd worn for Arthur's service. My expression was calm, solemn. "Welcome back," I said quietly. Their smiles faltered instantly as they took in my attire, the somber atmosphere. "Chloe, what's wrong?" Dan asked, frowning. "Where's Arthur? Is he napping?" "Arthur passed away peacefully on Saturday night, Dan," I stated, my voice even. "The memorial service was yesterday afternoon." The silence that followed was absolute. Shopping bags dropped to the floor. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Dan stared at me, his face cycling through shock, disbelief, then dawning calculation. Sophia looked confused, Megan horrified. "Passed away?" Eleanor finally choked out. "Without us? You held the funeral without us?" "His family was invited," I replied coolly, meeting her incredulous gaze. "I left multiple urgent voicemails regarding his rapid decline after you left. You chose not to respond or return from your cruise. But, but the will," Dan blurted out, his eyes darting towards Arthur's study. Did he change anything?" "He left this letter for you," I said, gesturing towards the envelope on the mantelpiece. Dan practically lunged for it, tearing it open. Eleanor read over his shoulder, her face tightening with fury as she absorbed Arthur's final words of disappointment and his stated intention to revise his will. "This is nonsense," Eleanor declared. "He wasn't in his right mind. He was dying." "Actually," I said, picking up the remote control, "he was remarkably lucid. He wanted you to see this." I pressed play. Arthur's face filled the large television screen. Calm, composed, his voice weak but clear, he began his testimony. They stood frozen, forced to listen as Arthur methodically recounted years of neglect, the missed appointments, the diluted medications, the siphoned funds, culminating in their final act of abandonment. He spoke of my unexpected kindness, our alliance, his decision to change his will while fully competent. "Jade Chloe," his voice echoed in the silent room, "showed me more dignity in 4 days than my own wife and stepson showed me in 4 years. She earned the right." Before the video even finished, the doorbell rang. Perfect timing. It was Ms. Evelyn Reed, Arthur's lawyer, punctual as always, briefcase in hand. "Good afternoon," she said formally, stepping inside, her sharp eyes taking in the stunned family members. "I am Evelyn Reed, executor of Arthur Vance's estate. I understand the family has now returned. I am here for the official notification regarding his final will and testament." "Let's get this over with," Dan snapped, clearly rattled but trying to regain control. "We know what the old will said." Ms. Reed opened her briefcase. Professor Vance executed a new will, along with associated trust documents, shortly before his passing. She produced the notarized documents. It is quite straightforward. Citing sustained neglect and abandonment during his terminal illness, documented extensively herein, she gestured towards the folders I had placed on the coffee table. Professor Vance has explicitly disinherited his wife, Eleanor Maxwell, and his stepson, Daniel Maxwell. Eleanor shrieked, a raw sound of disbelief and fury. Dan surged forward. "That's impossible. We'll contest it." "You are welcome to try," Ms. Reed replied calmly. "However, the will is ironclad, witnessed, notarized, filed, and supported by medical competency reports and Professor Vance's own recorded testimony, which you just viewed. Furthermore," she added, consulting another document. The primary assets, including this house and the bulk of Professor Vance's investment portfolio, were held within revocable trusts. Those trust documents were amended concurrently with the will, designating Ms. Chloe Maxwell as the sole successor trustee and primary beneficiary upon Professor Vance's death. There is quite literally nothing left in the probate estate for you to inherit or contest. The finality of it hit them. The house wasn't theirs, the hidden wealth wasn't theirs. They had abandoned Arthur, counting on an inheritance that no longer existed for them, an inheritance now legally mine. What about our college funds? Megan asked suddenly, her voice small, directed at Dan and Eleanor. Grandpa Arthur set those up. Dan couldn't meet her eyes. Ms. Reed answered gently. Mr. Vance provided significant funds to Mr. and Mrs. Maxwell for that purpose several years ago. Unfortunately, investigation via the trust records indicates those specific educational accounts were never established by the trustees. Megan stared at her parents, horror dawning on her face. They had spent her college money, too. The scene devolved into chaos. Eleanor screamed accusations at me, at Ms. Reed, at Dan. Dan turned on his mother, blaming her. Sophia backed away towards the door, clearly realizing she'd allied herself with a losing, and now penniless, proposition. Megan just stood there, tears streaming down her face. I watched them for a moment, the architects of their own destruction. Then, I retrieved my wedding ring from my pocket, the one I'd quietly removed weeks ago, and walked over to Dan. I placed it firmly in his palm. I believe this belongs elsewhere now, I said quietly, glancing towards Sophia, who was edging towards the door. Consider the divorce filed. I picked up the small overnight bag I'd packed earlier that morning, having anticipated needing to leave quickly after the reveal. Arthur found his peace, I said, addressing the room, though mostly speaking to myself. And now, so will I. I walked out of the house, leaving the shouting, the tears, the recriminations behind me. I didn't look back. The coastal wind felt clean on my face. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away towards my own quiet apartment, towards my own future. Finally free. The Thanksgiving Testament had been delivered. Justice, in its own strange, complicated way, had been served.